The emergency room stopped breathing the moment the dog moved. He was old, gray-muzzled, built like a shadow with muscle underneath. A retired military K9 who had survived 3 combat deployments and never once acted without purpose. His handler, a broad-shouldered man with a jaw like carved stone, had barely settled into a plastic chair when the dog pulled free and walked. Not ran, walked, directly toward the pregnant nurse behind the intake desk. She looked up, confused, one hand pressed to her lower back. The dog sat down at her feet and would not move. And that was the moment nobody in Harborview ER understood yet, that the animal wasn't being friendly. He was sounding an alarm. Before this story goes any further, if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or written off while quietly carrying everything, this one is for you. Follow along to the end, hit like, and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night it happened, Coastal Ridge Medical Center was running at 140% capacity. That was not unusual for a Tuesday in late October. The hospital sat on the edge of Marlow Bay, a mid-sized coastal city in the Pacific Northwest, where fishing families, shipping dock workers, and retired military personnel all funneled into the same overworked emergency department when things went wrong. The ER had 32 beds, a waiting area built for 40 people that currently held 61, and a staff stretched so thin that the charge nurse had eaten half a granola bar over the course of a 12-hour shift and called that lunch. Her name was Dara Weston. She was 8 months pregnant, wearing compression socks under her scrubs because her ankles had started to swell sometime around hour 4, and she had not sat down in 2 hours because the moment she sat down, someone always needed something, and standing back up was getting harder than she wanted to admit. She had dark circles under her eyes that concealer no longer touched. She had a habit of pressing the heel of her palm against her lower back when she thought nobody was watching, a small, private negotiation with her own body. I know, just a little longer. Nobody watched. That was the thing about Dara. She had worked at Coastal Ridge for 6 years, and in those 6 years she had become the kind of person the hospital ran on but did not particularly think about. She was reliable. She was quiet. She did not complain, did not gossip at the nurses' station, did not linger after her shift ended to collect sympathy for how hard her night had been. She showed up, she worked, she went home. The attending physicians had learned to trust her instincts without fully registering that they were doing it. If Dara flagged something, it mattered, but they rarely stopped to examine why that was true. She was, in the hospital's collective understanding of itself, ordinary. What the hospital did not know was that Dara Weston had once operated under a different name in a different life, and that the hands placing IV lines and triaging chest pain had done those same things in field conditions, in dust and smoke and darkness, with artillery running in the background and men who were bleeding faster than she could work. She did not talk about that. She had stopped talking about a lot of things 5 years ago when the letter arrived and the world rearranged itself around a grief so complete that the only way through was to become someone else, someone quieter, someone who stayed inside the edges of a job she knew well and did not reach past them. The pregnancy had not been planned exactly, but it had not been unwelcome. She was 34, on her own, and the baby had arrived as something that felt, against all logic, like a second chance at the kind of ordinary life she had been trying to construct. She had told herself she would take leave at 36 weeks. She had now passed 36 weeks by 11 days, and she was still here because the staffing board had 3 open positions and winter illness season was peaking, and Dara Weston had never in her professional life walked away from something that needed doing. That night, she was managing intake for the 3rd straight hour when the automatic doors opened and Marcus Hale walked in. She recognized him from his previous visits, not the man himself exactly, but the type. Late 50s, barrel-chested, wearing a button-down flannel despite the cold, carrying himself with the particular compressed stillness of someone who had been very physical for most of his life, and was now in pain that his pride would not allow him to acknowledge directly. He had a deep laceration on his forearm wrapped in a paper towel that had soaked through, and he stood at the intake window with the expression of a man who would very much like to not be here. "Caught it on a winch cable," he said before she could ask, "fishing out of Briar Dock." "When did this happen?" Hour ago, maybe. Sir, this is going to need sutures, possibly more depending on depth. She was already reaching for the intake form. Have you had anything to drink tonight? 2 beers before the accident. I'm fine. I'm not asking to judge you. I'm asking because it affects how we treat you. She slid the clipboard across. Blood type, if you know it? Oh, positive. She noted it. Her handwriting was steady. Her lower back was not. The waiting room behind Marcus Hale contained, among its 61 occupants, a toddler with croup, who had been crying in cycles for 40 minutes, an elderly woman with a possible hip fracture sitting very still because movement hurt, 2 dock workers who had been in the same fistfight and were now carefully ignoring each other from opposite corners, a young man in his 20s who had told intake he was having chest pain and then immediately started texting, and, in the far corner near the vending machines, a man sitting alone with a large dog at his feet. The dog was the kind of animal that made people give it space without knowing why. Not threatening, just significant. Gray around the muzzle, with amber eyes that moved slowly around the room like they were cataloging it. The man attached to the leash was tall, maybe 40, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of posture that did not fully relax even when sitting. He held his left wrist at an angle that suggested it hurt and was being deliberately not held, which Dara had clocked the moment she'd seen him check in 40 minutes ago. Suspected fracture, waiting for X-ray availability. His name on the intake form was Nolan Vress. She hadn't spoken to him beyond the initial intake exchange. There had been no time. There was never time in this ER for anything other than the next necessary thing. She processed Marcus Hale's paperwork, flagged his chart for the laceration team, handed him a proper bandage to replace the soaked paper towel, and turned to update the board. That was when the dog stood up. She didn't notice immediately. She was looking at the board, mentally calculating wait times, when she heard the shift in the room, not a sound exactly, but a change in atmosphere. The low murmur of 61 people sitting with their various miseries adjusted somehow, the way a flock of birds will all angle slightly before any of them move. She turned. The dog, Nolan Vress's dog, was standing in the center of the waiting area, not moving toward the exit or toward its handler. Moving toward her. Halt! The man's voice was quiet, but precise. A command voice, the kind that expected response. The dog did not respond. It kept walking. Steady, deliberate, head low, not aggressive, just committed, in the way of an animal that has decided something and cannot be redirected. People shifted their feet out of the way. The toddler with croup stopped crying for a moment and stared. The dog reached the intake desk, and Dara Weston, who had seen a great many things in her professional life, looked down at the gray-muzzled animal who had just planted himself at her feet and would not be moved, and felt something cold and formless move through her chest. The dog sat. It looked up at her, and it did not look away. I'm sorry. Nolan Vress had crossed the waiting room and was at the desk, leash in hand, embarrassment pulled tight across his features. He's trained. He doesn't do this. Holt, come. The dog's ears moved slightly. He did not come. It's all right, Dara said, which was what she said to most things. She looked at the animal more carefully now. The amber eyes were fixed on her midsection. The dog's nostrils were flaring in a slow, deliberate way, the way a K9 worked an odor she knew, because she had seen it before in a different context, in a different life, and the memory landed in her chest before she could stop it. What's his name? She asked. Holt. He's retired. Military working dog. A small pause. We were both active until about 2 years ago. What branch? The question came out before she filtered it. The man's eyes shifted. A slight recalibration, the way someone looks when a stranger asks something that implies a level of familiarity with the answer. Army, he said. Special operations. How long? 14 years. She nodded once and looked back down at the dog. Holt, she said softly, not as a command, just as a name. The dog's tail moved once, slow, like a flag in low wind. Behind her, Dr. Renata Forsyth, the attending physician who had been managing the overnight shift, appeared from the hallway and took in the scene with the expression she reserved for things that delayed her. Weston, can we get the board updated? We've got 2 admissions pending. 1 minute. We don't have a minute. We've got... Forsyth stopped, looked at the dog, looked at Nolan Vress. Is that animal supposed to be in the patient area? He's a service animal, Nolan said, which was not technically a lie, but was not exactly the complete truth either. He needs to be with his handler and not at the intake desk. Forsyth's voice had the particular texture of someone who had been on shift for 11 hours and had used up their patience somewhere around hour 7. Nolan reached for the leash, pulled once. Holt's paws dragged on the floor, fractionally, before the dog stood and moved, but he moved slowly, with the reluctance of an animal that disagreed with what it was being asked to do. Dara watched him go and told herself the cold feeling in her chest was just the temperature. The hospital ran cold at night because the HVAC system in the older wing was calibrated wrong and nobody had fixed it yet. That was the reason. She updated the board. She answered 2 calls. She processed a walk-in with a possible broken toe and a woman whose husband was in the cardiac unit on floor 3 and who had come down to the ER because she could not sit in the waiting room upstairs anymore and needed somewhere to be. Dara listened to her for 4 minutes, which she did not have, and then found her a chair near the quieter end of the waiting room and asked a volunteer to check on her in 30 minutes. She did all of this and noticed peripherally that her vision had done the thing twice now. Not quite blurred, just slightly wrong around the edges, the way the world looks when you stand up too fast. She had attributed it to fatigue. She had been attributing a great many things to fatigue lately. Her head had a dull, insistent ache that had been present since early afternoon. She had taken 2 ibuprofen at 3 o'clock and then remembered that she wasn't supposed to take ibuprofen during the 3rd trimester and felt briefly foolish and then forgotten about it because there was always something else. She pressed her palm to her lower back and kept moving. At 11:14 p.m., the trauma bay received a motorcycle accident, a 22-year-old with road rash and a possible splenic laceration, and the department lurched into the higher gear that a level 2 trauma required. Dara moved to support, pulling supplies, coordinating the incoming surgeon's instructions, doing the 47 small necessary things that kept a trauma room functional. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Her hands were steady even when the room was loud, and the attending, Dr. Forsyth, knew without looking that if she'd asked Dara to hold pressure or manage the airway, Dara would do it correctly. She did not register the way Dara's jaw was set, or the way she blinked twice rapidly while reading the monitor. Nobody in that room registered it. Across the department in the waiting area, Holt registered it. The dog was on his feet again. Nolan had been watching Holt for the past 20 minutes with the focused attention of a man who knew his partner's behavior well enough to take it seriously. Holt had worked odor detection for over a decade. Not explosives, not narcotics, but medical alerting. He had been trained for it after Nolan's own medical discharge, retrained specifically for that purpose, and in 2 years of post-military work, he had flagged 4 serious medical events before clinical staff had identified them. Nolan had a fractured wrist. He was also slightly concussed, which he had not told the intake nurse because he had driven himself to the hospital, and admitting to a head injury would have complicated things. The headache behind his left eye was a particular kind of headache that he recognized from experience, and he had decided to let the wrist be treated and deal with the rest later. He had not come to the hospital looking for anything except a cast. Holt apparently had other plans. The dog was oriented toward the trauma bay. Completely still, weight forward, not vocalizing, but positioned in the way he positioned himself when he had located a target scent and was waiting for Nolan to read the signal. "Holt," Nolan said quietly. "Stand down." Holt did not stand down. Nolan looked toward the trauma bay. Through the partial window in the swinging door, he could see movement, blue scrubs, the edge of a gurney, someone's gloved hands. He could see the intake nurse, Weston, her badge had said, moving along the counter edge, talking to a colleague, pulling a chart. He watched her for a moment. He had noticed things about her that most people probably hadn't. The way her movements were efficient but slightly compressed, the micro-hesitation before she stood up from a chair, the way she'd blinked twice while reading a monitor that she hadn't needed to blink at. He had noticed these things because noticing things had been his job for 14 years, and the habit did not switch off. He had also noticed the color of her face. It was not right, not dramatically wrong, not the gray-green of someone about to pass out, but something subtler. A dullness to her complexion that sat underneath the normal pallor of night shift fluorescent lighting. A slight puffiness around her eyes and jaw that had not been there, he suspected, a week ago. He was not a doctor, but Holt was sitting at rigid attention, pointing like a compass needle, and Nolan Vress had never once in 14 years ignored that signal. He stood up, wrist screaming at him, and walked to the nurse's station. The nurse behind the secondary desk was a young man named Brock, who had been on shift for 6 hours and was currently trying to do 3 things at once. "Excuse me," Nolan said. "One moment." The charge nurse. "Weston, has anyone checked her vitals tonight?" Brock looked up. "I'm sorry?" "Her blood pressure. Has anyone checked it?" "Sir, I don't—" "She's staff. She's not a patient." "I understand that." Nolan kept his voice level. "I'm asking if anyone has physically checked it tonight." Brock stared at him with the expression of someone who was not sure if this was a complaint or a concern or something else entirely. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Yes. You can get someone to check that nurse's blood pressure. Tonight. Soon." He walked back to his seat. Brock watched him go, then looked across the department at Dara Weston, who was at that moment efficiently pulling a chart and showing no visible sign of distress. Brock made a note to mention it to someone when things slowed down. Things did not slow down. At 11:47 p.m., Dara was restocking the supply cart near exam room 3 when she set down a box of gloves and stood still for a moment. The hallway was not spinning. She was clear on that. The walls were where they were supposed to be. But there was something wrong with the pressure inside her skull. Not pain exactly, not a headache, more like the sensation of being inside a room where someone had turned up the atmospheric pressure and not mentioned it. Her ears felt full. There was a faint shimmer at the left edge of her vision that she had been telling herself was the fluorescent lights for the past 2 hours. It was not the fluorescent lights. She knew that. She pressed both hands flat on the supply cart and breathed. "Weston." "Doctor." Forsyth appeared from exam room 2, gloves off, chart in hand. She stopped when she saw Dara at the cart. "You doing okay?" "Fine." The word came out at exactly the right speed and inflection. She had a great deal of practice saying fine. Forsyth looked at her for a moment with the specific attention of a clinician whose instincts were occasionally smarter than her schedule allowed. Then the monitor in room 2 alarmed, and Forsyth turned and went back. Dara straightened up. Her vision shimmered again. She thought about the baby. The small, specific weight of her, the way she had been less active today than yesterday, and Dara had noted it and filed it under things she would mention at her next OB appointment, which was Friday, which was 3 days away. 3 days felt like a long time, suddenly. She turned around and Nolan Vress was standing at the end of the hallway. He was not supposed to be in this part of the department. Patients and visitors were not permitted past the double doors. He had a fractured wrist and an air of someone who did not particularly follow instructions they disagreed with. Holt was beside him. The dog looked at Dara with his amber eyes and made a sound. Not a bark, not a whine. Something quieter. A sound of certainty. "Mr. Vress," Dara said, "you can't be back here." "I know." He did not move. "When did your headache start?" She went very still. "I need you to go back to the waiting." "When did it start?" She looked at him. At the way he was standing. Not aggressive, not dramatic, just fixed. The way the dog was fixed, with the particular quality of someone who has committed to a thing and is waiting for the world to catch up. "Early afternoon," she said, "around 2. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. "How's your vision?" The shimmer was happening right now, right at this moment. She didn't answer. "There's a BP cuff 12 feet to your left," he said. "I'd like you to use it." Duck. She almost said no. The reflex was immediate and specific. "I'm fine, I'm working. I'm the one who takes care of things here, not the one who receives care." And it sat in her chest like a clenched fist. She had spent 5 years constructing a life in which she was functional and necessary and not a burden, and asking for a blood pressure check at 11:50 p.m. on a Tuesday felt like a crack in something she had been keeping very carefully sealed. but the shimmer was back, and the baby had not moved in 3 hours. She walked to the BP cuff. Nolan did not follow her. He stayed at the end of the hallway and watched. Holt sat beside him, still, alert. She wrapped the cuff around her left arm. The machine ran its cycle. The numbers appeared. She stared at them for 4 full seconds. Systolic, 168. Diastolic, 112. There were readings you saw on patients that moved you from clinical neutrality into something more urgent, and 168 over 112 at 8 months pregnant was one of them. She had seen this number before on other women, and she knew what it meant, what it could mean if left unaddressed, what it could become within hours if the underlying cascade was already in motion. She pressed the cuff button again. 168 over 114. The word that entered her mind was the clinical term, and it landed with the particular weight of something she had known, on some level, for days, and had been too tired or too stubborn or too needed to act on. The headache, the vision, the swelling she had attributed to being on her feet, the reduction in fetal movement she had told herself was the baby repositioning. She had spent her entire career seeing through patients who minimized their symptoms, and she had been doing it to herself for a week and a half. She was already reaching for the call button when Dr. Forsyth came around the corner with a chart and stopped dead. The expression that crossed Forsyth's face when she looked at the BP monitor, and then at Dara, and then at Dara's face, was not a medical expression. It was something more human and more immediate. The expression of someone who has just understood that a mistake has been building for a long time and has finally arrived at a price. Dara. Forsyth's voice was different. The scheduling pressure had gone out of it entirely. I know, Dara said. I know. I need you to page OB now. She was already pulling off her lanyard with her one free hand, setting it on the counter with the deliberate motion of someone transferring authority, completing the small professional ritual of stepping out of one role and into another. Nurse to patient. That crossing felt more disorienting than almost anything she had experienced in years. Behind her, she heard Forsyth's voice rising, calling down the hallway, the department rearranging itself around her the way departments do when something real has happened and everyone suddenly understands it. She turned once and looked toward the hallway. Nolan Vress was still standing there. He gave her a slight nod. Not triumphant, not dramatic. Just, I see you. Holt's tail moved once, then 2 nurses were at her elbows, and a wheelchair was appearing from somewhere, and the next 20 minutes became the kind of controlled urgency that she had always stood on the outside of, and now she was in the center of it, and it felt terrifyingly like being cared for. Her blood pressure read 171 over 116 by the time they reached the OB floor. The on-call OB doctor, Marisa Pell, reviewed the numbers and the symptom history with the tight, focused expression of someone who is calculating time remaining on a situation she does not want to let run. How long have you had the headache? Since about 2. Vision changes? Yes, left peripheral. And you've been on shift since? 7 a.m. There was a pause in which Dr. Pell did not say what Dara knew she was thinking, because what Dara was thinking it too, and the thought was 17 hours and nobody noticed, and she didn't say anything, and here we are. We're going to run labs, Dr. Pell said, and we're going to make a decision about delivery based on what we see. If your platelets are dropping and your liver enzymes are elevated, I know what that means, Dara said. Dr. Pell looked at her. I know you do. A brief human pause. We're going to take care of you, both of you. Dara nodded. She was very calm. She had spent so long being calm in rooms like this that she did not know how to stop. But when the fetal monitor was attached and she heard the baby's heartbeat, fast, present, real, something shifted in her chest that had nothing to do with clinical training, and she put her hand flat on her stomach and held it there. Downstairs, in the ER waiting room, Nolan Vress sat back in his plastic chair, and Holt laid his gray head on Nolan's knee and closed his eyes. And from the break room at the far end of the ER corridor, through a half-open door, a man stood watching the activity on the OB floor notification board with an expression that was not concern and was not surprise and was not anything warm at all. His badge read, Administrative Director, Dr. Sterling Price. He looked at the name that had just been entered into the system under emergency OB intake. Weston D. He reached for his phone. Sterling Price put his phone down after 43 seconds. He had not made a call. He had opened his contacts, scrolled to a name, and then stopped. Not from indecision, but from the particular patience of a man who understood that most problems resolve themselves if you let them run a few more hours without intervening. He set the phone face down on the break room counter and poured himself a cup of coffee that had been sitting since 9 p.m. and was now the temperature and consistency of something punitive. He drank it anyway. Price had been administrative director at Coastal Ridge Medical Center for 11 years, which was long enough to have outlasted 3 chiefs of medicine, 2 major accreditation reviews, and 1 lawsuit that had been settled quietly enough that most of the current staff didn't know it had happened. He was not a physician. He had an MBA and a master's in healthcare administration and a talent for reading institutional risk the way other people read weather, not what was happening right now, but what was building on the horizon. What was building on the horizon, as of 11:58 p.m. on a Tuesday, was a charge nurse who had just been admitted to OB with a serious hypertensive condition after working a 17-hour shift. That was, in the language of administrative risk, a problem. Not because he felt responsible for it. He had reviewed staffing protocol. He had signed off on shift coverage. He had approved the decisions that led to the department running at the margins it was running at. And he had done so with the full understanding that those margins were acceptable within the framework of the hospital's current operational model. And if the framework had gaps, those gaps were industry standard gaps, not anomalies. That was what he would say when someone asked. He was not certain yet who would ask or when, but someone would. He finished the coffee, left the break room, and walked the long way back to his office, through the administrative corridor, away from the OB floor and away from the ER, where the dog and the soldier were still sitting, and where the night shift was now running short-handed in a way that would need to be addressed by morning. He sat at his desk and opened the staffing file. He began to edit. On the 4th floor, Dara Weston's labs came back at 12:22 a.m. Dr. Marissa Pell stood at the bedside and read them in the practiced way of someone who had hoped for one outcome and received another. Her expression did not change dramatically, but Dara, who had been reading doctors' faces for 6 years, saw the specific tightening around her eyes and knew before Pell said anything. Your platelets are low, Pell said. Not critically, but they're trending. Your liver enzymes are elevated. The protein in your urine is significant. She paused. Combined with the BP readings and the symptoms you've been having, the headache, the visual disturbance, this is preeclampsia with severe features. You know what that means. It means we're delivering tonight. It means we need to discuss it. You're at 37 weeks and 3 days, which is term enough that the baby's lungs should be fine. But given how quickly your numbers are moving, waiting isn't something I'm comfortable with. Dara looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not because she was emotional. She was, somewhere underneath the clinical layer, but she was holding it at a careful distance the way you hold something hot. But because she needed a second to translate from the version of herself that understood everything Pell was telling her into the version of herself that was a patient lying in a hospital bed, alone, making a decision about her child. What are the options? She asked, and she asked it the way she would ask it for any patient, in the same steady tone. We can attempt induction, but given how rapidly you're progressing, there's a real possibility it won't work fast enough. Given the severity of your features, I think cesarean is the right call. But I want you to understand that's my recommendation, not a mandate. You have... Do it, Dara said. Pell stopped. I trust your judgment, Dara said, so I schedule it. There was a pause in which the two women looked at each other, physician to nurse to patient, the full complexity of that triangle in the air between them. And then Pell gave a single nod. Okay, we'll prep you now. We'll aim for the OR in 40 minutes, give anesthesia time to... Is there someone we should call? The night nurse, whose name was Gabrielle, spoke from the corner where she had been charting quietly. She had a kind face and the particular gentleness of someone who had been in OB long enough to know exactly what this moment felt like for a patient who had no one in the waiting room. Dara thought about the question for longer than it should have taken. No, she said finally. There isn't. Gabrielle nodded without judgment and went to prepare the consent forms. Downstairs, a different kind of conversation was happening. Nolan Vress had been seen by a physician's assistant, confirmed the fracture in his left wrist, been fitted with a temporary splint, and been told that an orthopedic consult would contact him in the morning. He had said thank you and meant it, and then sat back down in the waiting room because Holt had not moved from the position he'd been in for the past hour and a half, and because Nolan had learned over 14 years to stay close when his partner held a position. The waiting room had thinned. The dock workers had been treated and discharged. The toddler with croup was upstairs on a pediatric floor with a humidifier and an exhausted father. The young man with chest pain had turned out to have a legitimate cardiac arrhythmia and was being monitored in the telemetry unit. The elderly woman with the possible hip fracture had been moved through. The remaining occupants were mostly people in the middle of waits that hadn't resolved yet, and they sat with the particular suspended quality of people who have given themselves over to institutional time. Nolan was looking at his phone, reading nothing, when the ER's night shift coordinator, a compact woman in her 40s named Louise, came to find him. Mr. Vress, she stopped in front of him, I wanted to let you know, the nurse who was at intake tonight, Weston, she's been admitted. Nolan looked up. She's stable, Louise said quickly, reading his expression. They're managing her, but I wanted you to know that your concern earlier, asking Brock to have someone check on her. She stopped, reorganized something in her expression. It mattered. I don't know if anyone said that to you. Nobody did, he said. Well, Louise looked like she wasn't quite sure how to finish the sentence. It mattered. She left. Nolan put his phone in his pocket. He thought about the woman at the intake desk, the way she had moved through the department like she was load-bearing, like the whole machine required her specifically, and she knew it and had accepted that obligation so long ago that she'd stopped questioning whether it was fair. He thought about the look on her face when she'd read the BP numbers. Not panic, something worse than panic, recognition. The look of someone who had known a thing was coming and had made themselves not know it. He had seen that look before, in different contexts. He had worn it himself, probably. Holt put his head back on Nolan's knee. Nolan rested his uninjured hand on the dog's neck, and they sat together in the fluorescent quiet, and Nolan thought about the strange arithmetic of a night that had started with a broken wrist and arrived here. He did not go home. At 1:17 a.m., Dara Weston's daughter was born. She came into the world in OR2 on the 4th floor, in the particular organized chaos of an emergency cesarean, and she was small and furious, and her first sound was a cry so sharp and immediate that 2 of the nurses in the room made involuntary sounds of their own. The release of breath that comes when a thing you've been braced for resolves in the right direction. The neonatologist called her a good size for gestational age. 5 pounds 14 ounces, lungs working, color coming in properly, all the right reflexes. Dara heard the cry and closed her eyes. She had been behind the drape, lying flat, with the anesthesiologist talking her through the pressure and the pulling in a low, steady voice, and she had been managing herself the way she managed everything, by staying inside the technical understanding of what was happening, by treating her own body as a medical event that she was attending rather than a thing she was inside. That strategy had worked until the cry. The cry undid her completely. Not dramatically. She didn't sob. She turned her head to the side and pressed her lips together and let 2 tears go sideways into her hair, and then she pulled herself back together, and by the time Gabrielle brought the baby to the side of the drape for Dara to see, she was composed enough to look at her daughter's face with something that was equal parts awe and exhaustion and a grief so specific and private it had no public form. The baby was wrinkled and damp, and her eyes were scrunched shut, and she was the most real thing Dara had looked at in 5 years. Hey, Dara said. Her voice was wrecked. The baby's mouth moved. I know, Dara said. Me too, Utab. By 2 a.m., the story had begun to move through the hospital in the way that hospital stories do. Not through formal announcement, but through the connective tissue of a staff that spent 12-hour shifts in close quarters and knew each other's business despite themselves. The ER night shift knew because Louise had been there. The OB floor knew because they were there. The surgical team knew. The overnight security staff knew because one of them had buzzed the OB team through, and he told the next person he saw. And that was enough. By the time the day shift started at 7 a.m., Dara Weston's name was on the lips of most of the nurses and a number of the physicians, attached to varying degrees of information and various colorings of response. Some of them felt genuine concern, the immediate human response to a colleague in trouble. Some of them felt the uncomfortable weight of retrospect. I worked beside her last Tuesday. Was she showing signs? Did I miss something? Did I not look? Some of them, if they were honest, felt a version of what people feel when something that seemed fine turns out not to have been fine, which is a low-level defensive need to establish that it wasn't their fault. None of them knew the full picture. The full picture was beginning to assemble itself in ways that only Sterling Price, sitting in his office on the administrative floor, currently understood. And Price was doing his best to ensure the picture remained partial. He had spent the hours between midnight and 6 a.m. reviewing files with the focused efficiency of a man who understood documentation. He had revised the staffing records for the preceding 3 weeks. Not fabricated, he was careful about that distinction, but edited for clarity, for emphasis, for the particular framing that placed operational decisions in their most favorable light. He had reviewed the scheduling overrides that had allowed Dara to continue working past her recommended leave date. He had found 3 sign-offs and made sure his name was not adjacent to any of them. He had also pulled Dara Weston's employee file. He had pulled it specifically to look at her pre-employment background, the military service she had listed, the dates, the role designation. Combat medical specialist, it said. 4 years active duty, honorable discharge. She had not elaborated in her application, and nobody had pressed her on it during hiring, and in 6 years nobody had had occasion to look at it closely. Price looked at it now. He looked at the dates. He looked at the unit designation. And then he looked at something else. A flag in the system he had never paid attention to before. A small administrative note attached to her file that had been placed there 18 months ago by a previous HR director who had since moved on, and which read, Candidate background, advise verification, classified service record components, see attached clearance form. Nobody had followed up on the clearance form. Price stared at the flag for a long time. Then he closed the file and began drafting a memo. Nolan Vress finally went home at 4 a.m. after a volunteer coordinator had taken his information and promised to pass along that he had asked about Weston's status. He drove with his right hand, his splinted left wrist resting in his lap, Holt in the back seat in the way he always rode. Alert, upright, watching the road behind them. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building near the waterfront, and it smelled like coffee and old wood and the particular ambient quiet of a space occupied by a man who had not spent much effort making it comfortable. There were boxes that had never been fully unpacked from when he'd moved in 8 months ago. There was a good chair by the window that got morning light, and Holt had already identified it as his preferred location, and Nolan had stopped arguing about it. He fed the dog. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with his splinted wrist elevated on a folded dish towel and tried to sleep in the chair for an hour, and failed. His phone had a voicemail from his sister in Portland asking how the wrist was, because he'd texted her from the ER waiting room at some point during the evening. He listened to the voicemail and did not call back because it was 4 a.m. and waking her would alarm her more than it helped. He sat with the coffee and thought about the woman in the intake desk. He thought about the specific quality of her competence, not the performed kind, the kind that comes from years of doing a thing under conditions that required you to actually know what you were doing rather than approximate it. He had worked with enough medics to know the difference. She had it. Whatever she had done before the hospital, she had done it in a place where mistakes had consequences. He thought about the flag on her face when she had asked him what branch. Not curiosity. Something else. Something that recognized itself. He thought about the way Holt had moved across that waiting room. He had trusted Holt's judgment more times than he could count, in contexts more dangerous than a hospital waiting room, and the dog had never been wrong. That was not a statistical claim. It was a relational one. Holt read him and read the world through channels Nolan didn't fully understand, and the agreement between them was simpler than language. When Holt moved with purpose, you followed. He followed. The woman had been seen. Whether it had been in time, that was the part he wouldn't know until morning. He was still at the kitchen table when the sun came up over the water, gray and gradual, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives. Well, at 6:45 a.m., Sterling Price's memo was complete. It was addressed to Dr. Evelyn Kraft, the chief of medicine, and copied to the hospital's legal counsel and the head of HR. It was 3 pages. It outlined, in careful administrative language, a series of concerns related to the employment record of Dara Weston. Specifically, discrepancies in her military service documentation, the unresolved flag on her background clearance, and questions about whether she had appropriately disclosed certain aspects of her service history during hiring. It also noted, with what read as reluctant professional obligation, that her failure to self-report her deteriorating medical condition during active shift hours raised questions about clinical judgment and patient care liability. It was not a memo that said this is her fault. It was more sophisticated than that. It was a memo that created a frame, that introduced doubt, that established a paper trail, that positioned Dara Weston's crisis not as a failure of institutional support, but as a complexity surrounding a specific employee. Price had written memos like this before. They tended to work. He sent it at 6:52 a.m., 8 minutes before the day shift started, and then he went to get a better cup of coffee from the cafeteria on the second floor and waited for the day to begin. He did not know that 3 hours earlier, while he had been reviewing her employee file, something had been set in motion that he had not anticipated. He did not know because it had happened quietly, in the way that significant things sometimes do. Not with announcement or drama, but with the particular gravity of a stone dropping into still water. What had happened was this. At 2:38 a.m., the volunteer coordinator who had taken Nolan Vress's information had passed it to the night nursing supervisor. The night nursing supervisor, who had worked at Coastal Ridge for 19 years and had a specific response to men who sat in ER waiting rooms for 4 hours, making sure a stranger was okay, had looked up Nolan Vress's name. Not in the hospital system, in the general sense, because his wrist intake form had listed his previous employer as the United States Army, and she had a nephew in special operations and recognized certain things when she saw them. What she found, she had not expected. She had not mentioned it to anyone that night because 2:38 a.m. was not a time for making phone calls. But she had written a name on a piece of paper and left it on the day supervisor's desk with 3 words underneath it. You should know. The day supervisor arrived at 7:02 a.m., read the note, and picked up her phone. At 9:15 a.m., Dara Weston was lying in a hospital bed with her daughter asleep on her chest and a blood pressure that was finally, slowly, moving in the right direction when the door opened and a physician she didn't recognize walked in. He was older, 60s, in civilian clothes, but carrying himself the way military physicians carried themselves. Not rigid, but organized, every movement with a specific purpose. He had a lanyard with a name Dara didn't immediately process. Ms. Weston, he said, my name is Dr. Leonard Quayle. I'm with the Naval Health Research Coordination Office. He stopped at the appropriate distance from the bed, far enough to be non-threatening, close enough that he wasn't speaking across the room. I'm sorry to intrude. I know this is not the right morning for a conversation. Dara looked at him over the top of her daughter's head. The baby was warm and impossibly small, and smelled like the specific smell that Dara had not known she was waiting to know. Then why are you here? She asked. He looked at her carefully. Because your name came up this morning in a context that concerned us, he said, and because there's a memo currently circulating in this hospital's administrative structure that contains several claims about your service record, claims that are factually incorrect in ways that I suspect are not accidental. Dara went very still. The baby shifted, made a small sleep sound, settled. How did you get here this fast? She asked. We have a regional office in Marlow Bay, he said, and when certain names appear in certain kinds of documents, we're notified quickly. Another pause. Your record, Ms. Weston, is not incomplete. It's classified. There's a significant difference, and someone in this building has either deliberately confused the two or has been extremely careless about the implications. Dara looked at him for a long moment. Her daughter's heart beat steadily against her chest. What's in the memo? She asked. Dr. Quayle told her. By the time he finished, her face had the particular expression of someone who has been very patient for a very long time, and has just discovered that patience has an end. Who signed it? Dara asked. Price, Quayle said. Sterling Price, administrative director. She said nothing for a moment. The baby shifted against her chest, and she adjusted her arm without looking down, the movement automatic, already becoming instinct. What exactly does he claim about my record? Quayle pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. Not the memo itself. A summary he had handwritten, she realized, which told her something about how carefully he was managing what documents moved through what hands this morning. He states that your military service record contains discrepancies that were not disclosed during hiring. He implies that the classified designation on portions of your file suggests incomplete or falsified documentation. He also raises what he calls questions about clinical judgment related to your failure to self-report your medical condition during your shift. Dara absorbed this. He's using the classification as the weapon, she said. If he can't read it, he calls it suspicious. Yes. And the clinical judgment piece is his liability shield. If he can establish that I made a bad decision, the institution's exposure for the staffing conditions is reduced. Quayle looked at her steadily. You understand administrative law. I understand how institutions protect themselves. She paused. I watched one do it once before, with someone I cared about. I know what the playbook looks like. She did not elaborate on that, and Quayle did not push. What can you do? She asked. We can correct the record, formally, through the appropriate channels. The classified components of your service file can be verified without being disclosed. There's a process for that, a clearance-level summary that confirms the documentation is complete and legitimate without revealing operational content. He refolded the paper. That process normally takes 2 to 4 weeks. He sent the memo this morning. Yes. So in 2 to 4 weeks, this has already done whatever damage it's going to do. That's my concern, Quayle said, which is why I'm here at 9 in the morning instead of filing a form. Dara looked at the ceiling. Her blood pressure monitor beeped its slow, steady rhythm. The baby's weight on her chest was the most grounding thing she had felt in 5 years, and she was having to work against it, having to drag herself back into the part of her brain that was still operational, still capable of strategy, even though every cell in her body wanted to stay exactly here, in this bed, with this child, and let the world outside the room handle itself. It didn't work that way. It had never worked that way. Tell me what you need from me, she said. By 10 a.m., the memo had reached Dr. Evelyn Kraft. Kraft was 61, had been chief of medicine at Coastal Ridge for 7 years, and had the particular quality of someone who had survived long enough in institutional medicine to distinguish between problems and performances of problems. She read the 3 pages twice, slowly, and then set them on her desk and looked at the window for a moment. Then she called her assistant and asked her to get Sterling Price on the phone. He's in a meeting with... Get him out of it. Price arrived at her office 11 minutes later, composed in the way of someone who had been expecting this call and had prepared for it. He sat across from her desk with the specific posture of administrative confidence, relaxed enough to signal he wasn't worried, upright enough to signal he was taking this seriously. The Weston situation, Kraft said. She had the memo on the desk between them, but did not reference it directly. Walk me through your reasoning. I felt the hospital needed to have a clear picture of any liability exposure. The woman delivered a baby in our OR 5 hours ago. Which makes the timing sensitive, I understand that. But the underlying questions about her record are, Sterling. Kraft's voice did not rise, which was somehow more effective than if it had. What is the actual problem you're trying to solve here? A beat. Patient safety, he said, and institutional. I've read the staffing schedules for the past 3 weeks. Kraft turned 1 page on her desk. Not the memo, something else. Something she had clearly pulled before this meeting. She was scheduled for 32 hours over those 3 weeks. She worked 61. The overtime requests are in the system. They were approved. Another pause. Who approved them? Price's expression did not visibly change. Scheduling decisions go through multiple sign-offs. Your office approved the October coverage overrides. I checked this morning. Kraft looked at him directly. So what I'm reading in this memo is a document that raises questions about an employee while the person who signed it carries significant responsibility for the conditions that created her crisis. She let that land. I want you to understand how that looks. I understand how it looks, Price said. But the record discrepancy is a legitimate. I've already spoken with someone from the Naval Health Research Coordination Office. Kraft watched his face. They were here at 9. Her record is classified. That is not the same as discrepant. I've been told that a formal verification summary will be filed with HR by end of business today. Something moved behind Price's eyes. A recalibration, fast and subtle. That's good, he said carefully. That's the appropriate process. Yes, Kraft said. It is. She picked up the memo and held it for a moment. I'm going to ask legal to review this document before it goes any further. I'd like you to be available for that conversation. It was phrased as a request. It was not a request. Price left her office 5 minutes later and walked back to his own with the measured pace of someone who is thinking very quickly and not allowing that to show on their body. He sat at his desk and looked at his computer. He had files. He always had files. Documentation was how you protected yourself, and Price had been protecting himself for 11 years. There were emails and approvals and meeting notes and the accumulated paper architecture of a career spent learning to build walls before you needed them. He began to open folders. What he did not know, at that moment, was that 3 floors above him, Dr. Leonard Quayle was on the phone with a name that Price had not considered. Because why would he have considered it? It was a name that belonged to a chapter of the hospital's history that had been closed and filed and was not supposed to be relevant to anything happening today. The name was Dr. Petra Vasek. Vasek had been chief of emergency medicine at Coastal Ridge until 18 months ago, when she had resigned after what the official record described as a mutual decision related to departmental restructuring. The unofficial record, which existed only in the memories of the people who had been present, was different. Vasek had raised concerns about a pattern of emergency department understaffing that she believed was creating patient care risks. She had raised them internally, through proper channels, and then more formally, and then in writing, and then she had been told, with considerable diplomatic language, that her perspective was noted, and that the hospital was committed to ongoing improvement, and that perhaps the pressures of a demanding administrative role had affected her assessment. She had resigned 6 weeks later. She was currently working as a clinical consultant in Portland, 2 hours south. She was also, as of 10 minutes ago, on the phone with Quayle, whom she had known from a previous collaborative research project, answering questions she had expected someone to ask her for 18 months, and had not been asked until today. The pattern was there when I left, she said. I documented it. I submitted 3 formal reports. All 3 are in the system. Or they were. I'd want someone to verify they're still there. Can you give me the specific dates? She gave him the dates. The core issue, she said, was that Price had been approving staffing overrides systematically, not as emergency measures, which is their intended use, but as routine operations, which meant the department was running on a skeleton crew that was functionally normalized. On paper, every override was individually justified. In aggregate, they constituted a staffing failure that was being obscured by the approval mechanism itself. Did you raise this specific framing in your reports? I did. In the second one, explicitly. A pause. I also noted 3 specific cases where I believe the understaffing had contributed to adverse patient outcomes. One of those cases was subsequently reviewed by risk management, and the review concluded that the outcomes were within expected variance. The flatness in her voice on those last 3 words contained a great deal of controlled feeling. Which was the right conclusion if you reviewed each case in isolation. If you reviewed them as a pattern, you got a different answer. Who conducted the risk management review? A pause. Price's office coordinated it, she said. Quayle wrote something down. Dr. Vasek, I want to ask you something directly. Are you willing to provide a formal statement? A longer pause this time. Yes, she said. I've been willing for 18 months. Nobody asked. But at 11:30 a.m., Nolan Vress received a call from a number he didn't recognize, picked up because he'd been picking up unknown numbers all morning in case it was the hospital, and found himself on the phone with a night nursing supervisor named Dolores, who had 19 years at Coastal Ridge and a voice that sounded like she hadn't slept, which was because she hadn't. "I got your name from the intake volunteer," she said. "I hope that's okay." "It's fine. I wanted to tell you, she's okay. The baby's okay. I'm not supposed to share patient information, but you're not family, and technically this isn't—" She stopped, started again. "I pulled your background last night. I know that's overstepping, but I wanted to know who you were before I made any calls." Nolan was quiet for a moment. "What calls?" "There's something happening here today that's bigger than just last night," Dolores said. "And there are people in this building who would very much like the story of what happened to Dara Weston to stay small, to be a personal medical crisis and nothing else." She paused. "I don't think it should stay small. And I think what you did last night, what your dog did, I think that's part of it. I think there are people who need to know that the reason she was found in time is because everyone here missed it, and an outside party with a trained animal had to intervene. I'm not trying to make anyone look bad. I know, but the truth sometimes does that on its own." Another pause. "There's a man here, Price, our administrative director, who sent a memo this morning that tries to make this about her, about things she didn't disclose, decisions she made. And I've worked here for 19 years, and I know what that memo is and what it's trying to do." Her voice had steadied into something that sounded like it had been waiting to say this for a long time. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not comfortable with. I just wanted you to know what you walked into last night, and what you might be walking into now, if you stay interested." Nolan sat in the chair by the window. Holt was in the chair technically, but had shifted to make room and was now only half in it, his back legs on the floor, looking at Nolan. "Tell me about the memo," Nolan said. Well, the afternoon moved fast and badly for Sterling Price. At 12:45 p.m., legal confirmed they were reviewing the memo and that no further copies should be distributed. This was framed as procedural. It felt like something else. At 1:20 p.m., he received an email from HR noting that a verification summary from the Naval Health Research Coordination Office had been received and would be attached to Weston's employee file, and that the summary confirmed the completeness and legitimacy of her service documentation. The email was copied to Kraft. At 2:05 p.m., a request came through from Risk Management, not from Price's office, but initiated externally, to audit the staffing override approvals for the emergency department over the preceding 18 months. The request cited a specific provision in the hospital's operational review protocol that allowed for external audit triggers under certain conditions. The condition cited was a patient care adverse event involving a staff member. Price read the request 3 times. The thing that was happening was not what he had prepared for. He had prepared for a conversation about one nurse, one medical crisis, one set of questions. What was assembling itself instead was a structural review, the kind that, once initiated, did not stop at the edges of the immediate event, but followed the data wherever it went. He called his personal attorney at 2:15 p.m. The attorney listened and said, "Don't touch any files, don't move anything, don't delete anything, don't revise anything. Whatever is in the system right now, leave it. There are some documents that have been edited for—" "Sterling," the attorney's voice was level, "I need you to hear me. If there has been any modification of institutional records after this event, and that modification is discovered in the course of an audit, that is a significantly more serious problem than whatever the original records contained. Do you understand me?" Price understood. He sat very still at his desk and looked at his screen and thought about the edits he had made to the staffing files between midnight and 6 a.m. Dara did not know about the audit request. She did not know about Vasek's call, or Price's attorney, or the HR email. What she knew, in the early afternoon of that day, was that her daughter was in the bassinet beside her bed and her blood pressure was 142/91, which was still elevated but was moving in the right direction, and the headache had reduced from a constant to an intermittent, and she had eaten something. A bowl of soup that a floor aide had brought, which she had eaten with the focused determination of someone refueling a vehicle that had run near empty. She was tired in a way that went below physical. Gabrielle came in at 2 to check her chart and found her sitting up in bed with the baby in her arms, not looking at her phone or the television, just sitting, looking at the window. Not dramatically, just the particular stillness of someone who is processing something that requires more space than a single night provides. "Can I ask you something?" Dara said. Gabrielle looked up from the chart. "Of course." "The man from last night, in the ER, Vress." She had been given his name by Louise that morning, along with the message he had left. "Do you know if he's still in the building?" "I don't think so. He was discharged around 1 a.m., I think. Do you want me to?" "No." Dara shook her head. "I just wanted to know." Gabrielle made a note and left. Dara looked at the baby. She had not named her yet. Officially, not on paper. She had a name in her mind, had had it for weeks, but there was something about putting it on the form that had felt too final, too permanent, in the way that certain commitments do before you've survived the thing that was threatening to prevent them. They had survived. She reached into the bassinet and settled her daughter more securely in the crook of her arm, and the baby's hand opened and closed against Dara's wrist, finding purchase on nothing, just the reflex of a new life reaching for something solid. "Marin," Dara said quietly. The baby's hand closed. That was enough. Nolan came back to the hospital at 3 p.m. He had gone home, slept for 3 hours, and driven back with Holt because Dolores had asked him to come in and speak with someone from the Naval Coordination Office, and because the version of himself that had learned to trust when a thing was unfinished told him this was unfinished. He was escorted to a small conference room on the administrative floor, not Price's floor, a different wing, where Dr. Quayle was seated across from 2 other people Nolan did not recognize. One was a woman in her 50s in civilian clothes who had the particular quiet alertness of someone from an investigative background. The other was a man about Nolan's age in a hospital administrator's badge, who Quayle introduced as the interim department liaison for the risk management audit. Holt settled under the conference table, head on his paws, and waited. Quayle asked Nolan to walk through the previous evening, what he had observed, what Holt had done, when and how the concern about Weston had been raised, what the response had been. Nolan walked through it accurately and without editorializing, the way he had been trained to debrief. Sequence, observation, action, result. He did not characterize the night shift's response as negligent because it was not his job to characterize it, and he had not seen everything that happened. He described what he had seen. The woman in civilian clothes took notes. When he finished, she looked up. "In your assessment, based on your experience with Holt's alert behaviors, how long had the condition that he detected been present before he responded to it?" "Holt works scent," Nolan said. "He would have been detecting her chemical markers from the moment we arrived. He gave a passive alert within 15 to 20 minutes of intake and a full active response within 40. He paused. Based on the timeline, she had probably been symptomatic for most of her shift. The scent profile that Holt responds to, it builds over time, so his reaction was proportional to how long the condition had been developing. And he responded to her specifically, not to any other patient. Correct. The woman looked at Quayle. Something passed between them that Nolan couldn't fully read, but could categorize as, this matters, and we both know it. "There's one other thing," Nolan said, the staffing question. He had thought about how to frame this on the drive over, and had decided that framing was someone else's job and that his job was to report what he had observed. When I asked the staff to check on her, the secondary nurse at the desk, I asked him directly to have someone take her vitals. I was told he would pass it along when things slowed down. Things did not slow down. By my observation, the department was severely understaffed for the volume it was managing. That's not a clinical judgment, it's a capacity observation. I've worked in environments where you have to make decisions about what you can address and what you can't, and what I saw last night was a staff making those decisions constantly, all night. The room was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," Quayle said. "That's helpful." Nolan nodded. Under the table, Holt shifted and rested his chin on Nolan's foot, and Nolan felt the weight of it. Solid, warm, the specific comfort of an animal that has done its job and knows it. At 4:30 p.m., the audit request was formally expanded. The initial scope had covered 18 months of staffing override approvals. The expansion, requested by the woman in civilian clothes, whose name was Investigator Bryn Solano from the State Health Facilities Licensing and Certification Division, extended it to cover all adverse patient events reviewed by risk management during the same period, specifically those that had been attributed to individual clinical judgment rather than systemic factors. 3 cases. Dr. Petrovasic's 3 cases, identified 18 months ago, closed by the review process that Price's office had coordinated. Solano had the original reports. She had received them from Vasic by secure email at 1 p.m. She had cross-referenced them against the hospital's internal review conclusions and found what Vasic had said she would find: individually defensible determinations that, when read as a sequence against the staffing data, told a different story. The expanded audit would take time. Weeks, probably. Possibly longer, depending on what the document review produced. But the staffing files that Price had modified between midnight and 6 a.m. had already been flagged. The hospital's document management system, a detail Price had not accounted for because it had been upgraded 14 months ago with a forensic versioning feature that logged all edits, including the editor's credentials and the time of modification, had recorded every change he had made. Solano had been briefed on this at 4:15 p.m. by the hospital's IT security coordinator, who had pulled the version history as part of the audit protocol and had found the overnight editing session immediately. She had said nothing about it yet to anyone in the building except Quayle. She planned to say something about it in the morning. Price did not know about the version history. He was in his office at 5 p.m., managing the day's remaining operational items with the disciplined focus of a man who had decided that what had happened was manageable and that the appropriate strategy was normalcy. He had his attorney's number saved to his phone's home screen. He had reviewed the legal team's preliminary assessment, which was careful and noncommittal in the way preliminary assessments were designed to be. He had drafted and not sent 2 emails and sent one that said very little in a great many words. He was managing. His assistant knocked at 5:12 p.m. and said that Dr. Kraft wanted to see him at 5:30. He said that was fine. He reviewed his notes. He prepared what he was going to say. He did not know that at 5:28 p.m., 2 minutes before he was scheduled to arrive at Kraft's office, Kraft received a call from Solano. He did not know that the call lasted 6 minutes. He did not know what was said. He walked into Kraft's office at 5:30 p.m. and found her standing at the window rather than seated at her desk, which was unusual. She turned when he came in. "Close the door," she said. He closed it. "The audit has been expanded," she said, "and the IT team has pulled version histories on several administrative files that appear to have been modified after midnight last night." The room was very quiet. "The modification timestamps are logged under your credentials," she said, "between 12:43 a.m. and 6:07 a.m. Price stood very still. "Evelyn, I need you to not say anything right now that you haven't discussed with your attorney." Her voice was the flattest he had ever heard it. Not angry, not accusatory, something quieter and more final than either of those things. Because what happens next is going to be a formal process, and anything you say in this room before you have counsel present, "I edited for clarity," he said. "They're my own documents. I have every right to—" "Sterling," she looked at him. "Stop talking." He stopped. Through the window behind her, the late afternoon light was going silver over the water. The bay was calm. A fishing vessel was moving through the channel, its lights coming on in the early dusk, and from this height it looked small and very deliberate against all that gray water. "Effective immediately," Kraft said. "I'm asking you to step back from your duties pending the outcome of the audit review." She paused. "That's not a termination. That's a procedural step. But I need your badge and your system access credentials before you leave this office." Price stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and set his badge on her desk. He said nothing. He walked to the door and put his hand on the handle. And then he stopped, because his attorney had told him not to say anything, and he understood why. But there was something in him that was still looking for the version of this where he was not wrong, where the actions he had taken were defensible in the way he had always told himself they were, where the frame he had spent his career constructing held together one more time. The door opened from the outside before he could open it himself. A hospital security officer was on the other side. With him was investigator Bryn Solano, and behind her in the corridor, looking like someone who had been sitting in a hospital for 16 hours and had arrived at the end of her patience with institutional protection mechanisms, was Dara Weston. She was in a wheelchair, still in a hospital gown, IV port still in her arm, wearing the expression of a woman who had delivered a baby 12 hours ago and walked out of a recovery room because something required her to be present for it personally. She looked at Price. He looked at her. "Ms. Weston," Solano said from slightly behind Dara's shoulder, "you did not have to come down here." "I know," Dara said. She did not look away from Price. "I wanted to." The hallway held the moment the way hallways do, fluorescent and neutral and indifferent to what was happening inside it. Price looked at the wheelchair, at the IV port, at Dara Weston's face, and something in his own face moved through a rapid sequence of expressions before settling on the one that his attorney would have advised: controlled, neutral, neither guilty nor aggressive, the expression of a man managing a professional situation. It did not hold well against the way she was looking at him. She was not angry. That was the thing that was hard to read and harder to dismiss. He had expected anger, had in fact been preparing a calibrated response to anger, the measured reasonableness of someone who understood that emotions were running high, who was sorry she had experienced a medical crisis, who wanted to assure her that the memo was a procedural matter and not a personal one. He had that whole register ready. She was not angry, she was clear. The way a room is clear after the weather has moved through and everything unnecessary has been stripped away, and what's left is just the structure, just the actual shape of things. "I'm not here to make a scene," she said. Her voice was steady, if not entirely strong. There was a tiredness underneath it that she wasn't hiding. "I'm here because I wanted you to see me before whatever happens next happens." Price said nothing. "You wrote a memo," she said. "This morning, about my record, about my judgment." She paused. "You sent it before my daughter was 4 hours old." "Miss Weston, I understand you're... I'm not finished." Not loudly, just precisely. "You've worked in this building for 11 years. I've worked here for 6. You've seen me in this department. You've approved the schedules I worked on, and the overtime that accumulated, and the coverage gaps I filled, and not once in 6 years did you stop to ask whether any of that was sustainable. You just kept approving the requests." She stopped, breathed once deliberately. "And when it caught up with me, when my body failed after 17 hours on a shift, I should never have been cleared to work. Your first move was to make it about something I did wrong." Price opened his mouth. "I know why," she said. "I've known men like you since I was 22 years old and working in conditions that make this hallway look like a vacation. You don't do it because you're cruel. You do it because protecting the institution is the only thing you actually know how to do. And when the institution is the problem, the only tool you have left is finding someone else to be the problem instead." She looked at him for a moment longer. "I hope the audit is thorough." She turned the wheelchair herself. She had been handling it herself since she'd gotten in it, despite Gabrielle's protests, and rolled it back toward the elevator. Solano looked at Price once, briefly, with the expression of someone filing a mental note, and followed. The security officer remained. "Your credentials, Mr. Price," he said. "Whenever you're ready." Nolan was in the 4th floor corridor when the elevator opened. He had been heading out, had said what he needed to say in the conference room, had nothing official left to do in the building, and had been making his way to the lobby with Holt when he turned a corner and nearly ran into a nurse named Gabrielle, who was practically jogging to catch up with a patient who had apparently wheeled herself off the OB floor without waiting for clearance. He stopped. The wheelchair came around the corner and Dara looked up at him, and they both went still for a half second in the way of people who have been adjacent to something significant together and are now suddenly required to be in the same hallway. She looked worse than last night, and better at the same time, which didn't quite make sense until he parsed it. Worse physically. The pallor and the IV port and the hospital gown under a cardigan someone had draped over her shoulders, but her eyes were clearer. Whatever had been dimming them through 17 hours of night shift had resolved into something more direct. "You're still here," she said. "I had a meeting. I was just leaving." Holt stood at his knee and looked at her. His tail moved once, slow. She looked at the dog for a moment. Is he allowed to do that again, what he did last night? He's not really going to ask me. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. No, I suppose he isn't. Gabrielle arrived behind her, slightly out of breath. Ms. Weston, I really need you to… I know. Dara didn't look back. Give me a minute, Gabrielle. Gabrielle gave her a minute, very visibly and not happily. Dara looked at Nolan. I was told you stayed until 4 a.m. Holt wouldn't leave. Right. She accepted that, in the way of someone who understood operational loyalty and didn't need it explained. The meeting you had today, was that about what happened last night or about something bigger? Both, probably. She nodded slowly. The weight of the day was sitting on her in a visible way, and he had the specific impulse he recognized from years of working alongside people in difficult conditions. The one that said, don't offer comfort, offer information. It's what's actually useful. There's an investigator here, he said, from state licensing. The audit they're running is going to go wider than you probably know about yet. Her eyes sharpened. How wide? 18 months of staffing data and 3 prior patient cases that were closed in review. The next chief of emergency medicine is involved. I don't have the name, but she filed a formal statement today. Dara was quiet for a moment. Vasek, she said. It wasn't a question. He was slightly surprised. You know her? She resigned the month after I got back from medical leave 2 years ago. I thought it was a coincidence at the time. I think I was wrong. She pressed her lips together. She tried to tell someone. She did tell someone. They just didn't do anything with it. Until now. Until now, he agreed. Another pause. The corridor hummed with the ambient business of a hospital at late afternoon. Carts moving, voices from distant rooms, the PA system in the background calling something unintelligible. Thank you, Dara said. For last night. For staying. He wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he went with the simplest accurate thing. Holt found you. I just followed him. That's not quite true. No, he admitted, but it's the part that mattered. Gabrielle cleared her throat significantly. Dara reached down and touched Holt's head once, briefly. The dog held very still under it, accepting and dignified. And then she straightened and nodded at Nolan, and Gabrielle began steering the wheelchair back down the corridor, and Nolan stood and watched them go and thought about things he could not quite organize into words yet. Holt pressed against his leg. Yeah, Nolan said. I know. Matt. The audit moved the way institutional audits move, methodically, impersonally, with a momentum that built not through drama, but through the slow accumulation of documented fact. Solano's team spent the next 2 days at Coastal Ridge, and in those 2 days they pulled staffing records, risk management files, scheduling approvals, the version history logs from the document management system, and the original reports that Petra Vasek had filed before her resignation. They interviewed 14 staff members. They reviewed the 3 closed adverse event cases, this time with the staffing data alongside them rather than in isolation. The picture that assembled itself was not a picture of a single corrupt act. It was more complicated and more ordinary than that, which was in some ways worse, a pattern of decisions, each individually defensible, that in aggregate had produced a system in which emergency department staff were chronically overextended, patient risk was structurally elevated, and the mechanisms that were supposed to catch those conditions had been not sabotaged exactly, but managed, tended in a particular direction, by a man who understood the mechanisms well enough to keep them pointing away from the conclusions they should have reached. Price did not come back to the building after the evening he surrendered his badge. His attorney issued a statement on his behalf, 2 sentences, saying that Mr. Price was cooperating fully with the review process and had full confidence that the facts would be properly understood in context. This statement was distributed to no one in particular and received by everyone with the level of attention it deserved. The staff, the ones who had worked the night shifts, the ones who had filed overtime requests that were approved without anyone asking why overtime had become a structural feature rather than an exception, the ones who had treated sicker patients with thinner margins and gone home and come back and done it again. The staff had things to say, and they said them, in the interviews and in the hallways and in the break room conversations that are the actual tissue of institutional knowledge. Some of them felt vindicated. Some felt implicated in the low-level way of people who had known something was wrong and had not known how to say it or had not believed it would matter if they did. A few felt defensive, which was its own complicated kind of knowledge. Louise, the night shift coordinator, gave a 2-hour interview on the second day. She described what she had observed over the preceding 6 months in detail that was specific and chronological and had clearly been organized in her own mind for some time before anyone official asked for it. She mentioned Dara Weston 7 times, not dramatically, just accurately, as a recurring example of someone the system had been relying on past reasonable limits. When Solano asked her why she hadn't raised concerns through official channels, Louise looked at her for a moment and said, "I did. Twice." Through the department head. The responses were both sent from Price's office. A pause. "I filed the second one 14 months ago. I never heard back." Solano added this to the record. The record was getting long. Nibatat. On the third day, Dara went home. Her blood pressure had stabilized enough that Dr. Pell was comfortable with discharge, with the understanding that Dara would be seen in clinic twice in the first week, would have a visiting nurse for the first 4 days, and would under no circumstances be working a shift at any hospital for a minimum of 6 weeks, which Pell communicated in the specific tone of a physician who knows her patient is someone who will need to be told this directly and still might not follow it. Dara said she understood. She meant it. She was tired in a way that had moved past the physical into something structural, as if the tiredness was now part of her architecture, a weight-bearing element that needed to be worked around rather than removed in a single night of sleep. She moved slowly. She got winded on the stairs of her apartment and had to stop on the landing, Marin in her arms, and breathe for a moment before continuing, and she did not perform competence at herself during that 30 seconds on the landing because there was nobody there to perform it for. That was the part she was adjusting to. She had a friend, Tomasa, who had appeared at the hospital the morning after the delivery with a bag of groceries and the particular competence of a woman who had raised 3 children and knew what the first week home looked like. Tomasa had a key to Dara's apartment for exactly the same reason that Dara had a key to Tomasa's, because they were the kind of friends who had made those logistical provisions quietly, years ago, without making it into a thing, because that's how they both operated. Tomasa had stocked the refrigerator, cleaned the bathroom, set up the bassinet in the bedroom, and then sat with Dara for 2 hours and said very little because she understood that Dara needed to be somewhere quiet with someone she trusted and not be asked to explain anything. Marin slept. Dara slept. In the in-between hours when the baby was awake and Dara was feeding her, and the apartment had the specific 3 a.m. quality of a world reduced to its smallest necessary components, Dara thought about things she hadn't had space to think about during the acute chaos of the preceding days. She thought about the classified components of her service record, about the mission designation and the unit and the specific 9-month period that those records documented, which was the period that had ended with her husband's death and her own departure from military service and the beginning of the quieter life she had tried to build in its aftermath. She had not spoken about that period to anyone at Coastal Ridge. Not to colleagues, not to supervisors, not in any formal or informal context. It was hers, private, a chapter that she had closed not because she was ashamed of it, but because the grief attached to it was not something she wanted to carry in public, and because she had found that people's responses to that kind of history were more complicated than helpful. The awe that made her feel like an exhibit, the awkward discomfort that made her feel like a problem. She had wanted to be a nurse, a good one. That was enough. Price had tried to turn that privacy into a liability. He had taken the closed chapter and called it suspicious, and it had taken a naval coordination officer, an investigator, and a document audit to dismantle that frame. And even now, even with all of it in motion, she understood that the dismantling was not finished and would require more from her before it was. Marin's hand found her finger. She looked down at the small, impossibly confident grip. "I know," she said softly. "I'm working on it." On the 5th day, Petra Vasic drove up from Portland. She had not announced the trip to Dara specifically, had coordinated it through Quayle, who had mentioned to Louise, who had texted Tomasa, because institutional information traveled through women's networks faster than any official channel, and she arrived at Dara's apartment on a Thursday afternoon carrying a covered dish and the specific expression of someone who has been waiting to have a conversation for a long time and is not entirely sure how to begin it. Dara knew who she was before she opened the door. She had looked her up, had read the department chair press release from 18 months ago with the careful eye of someone reading between the lines. "You filed 3 reports," Dara said without preamble, because she did not have the energy for preamble, and Vasek had the look of someone who would prefer directness anyway. Vasek set the dish on the counter. "I did. One of them cited staffing conditions as a contributing factor in a patient outcome during my 2nd year here." "Yes." "I didn't know that." "You weren't supposed to," Vasek said. "The case was anonymized. Patient's right." She paused. "But I knew your name. I knew the shift. I knew what the department was running on that night." Dara looked at her. "Why did you leave?" Vasek was quiet for a moment. "Because I thought if I stayed and kept pushing, what would happen is they'd find a way to make it about me. My judgment, my management style, my inability to understand the operational realities." She paused. "And I was probably right about that. But leaving didn't fix it either. It just removed the person asking the questions. Until now." "Until now." Vasek sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, with the ease of someone who felt the apartment was a place where formality would be a waste of time. "How are you doing, actually?" "I'm tired," Dara said. "My blood pressure is still not normal. I have a 9-day-old baby and a 6-week leave, and after the leave I need to figure out what I'm going back to, because the department is going to be different, and I don't know different how yet." "Different better, probably." "Maybe." Dara sat down across from her. "Or different in the way that institutions get after a crisis, which is a lot of meetings and revised protocols and new documentation requirements, and fundamentally the same conditions with better paperwork." Vasek looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You're not optimistic." "I'm realistic. There's a difference." A pause. "But I also know that audits produce records, and records produce accountability, and accountability occasionally produces actual change if the people pushing it don't stop when the immediate crisis resolves." Dara looked at her steadily. "Are you going to stop?" "No," Vasek said. "Then maybe better." Bulk. The audit report's preliminary findings were released internally at Coastal Ridge on the 14th day. They were, in the careful language of regulatory documents, significant. The staffing override approvals over the 18-month audit period showed a pattern of systematic underreporting, not falsification of individual records, but a consistent framing practice that presented chronic understaffing as episodic, isolated, and situational rather than structural. The 3 adverse patient events had been reviewed in a process that, the preliminary finding noted, contained significant procedural irregularities, specifically the involvement of administrative leadership in determining the scope of review, which created a conflict of interest that should have precluded Price's office from coordinating the process. The document modification issue was addressed in a separate subsection. The language was measured. The conclusion was not. The overnight editing of staffing files by the administrative director, after the patient care event that triggered the audit, and before the audit had been formally initiated, constituted what the report characterized as interference with institutional record integrity. It noted that this finding had been referred to the State Attorney General's office for further review. The report also noted, in a section titled Contributing Factors, that the department had experienced the extended departure of experienced clinical leadership 18 months prior, and that subsequent administrative management of emergency department operations had not included adequate clinical oversight mechanisms. Petra Vasek's name did not appear in the report. Her fingerprints were on every page of it. Dr. Evelyn Kraft received the preliminary report on a Tuesday morning, read it in her office with her door closed, and then sat for 20 minutes looking at the water through her window. She had been chief of medicine for 7 years. She had made decisions in those 7 years that she could defend, and some she could not entirely, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to herself, alone in her office on a Tuesday. She picked up her phone and called Dara Weston. It rang twice. "Dr. Kraft?" Dara said. I wanted to call you myself before this becomes official." Kraft paused. "The preliminary audit findings are being released today. You'll receive a copy through HR. But I wanted you to know the report is clear about what happened, about why it happened, about what needs to change." Another pause. "I also want to say personally that I am sorry for what the institution allowed to develop and for what it cost you." Silence on Dara's end. "I'm not asking you to accept that," Kraft said. "I'm just saying it." "I hear you," Dara said finally. "Thank you for calling." She hung up. She sat in the rocking chair by the window with Maren asleep against her shoulder and looked at the middle distance for a moment. Then she texted Tomasa. "It's official," and Tomasa sent back 3 words. "About damn time." Price's situation resolved with the specific gravity of an institution protecting what it could protect. His formal resignation was submitted on the 16th day by his attorney, effective immediately. The resignation letter said nothing, which was probably accurate. There was nothing useful left to say. His system access had already been revoked. His office had been emptied by facilities staff over a weekend, which had a small operational brutality to it that nobody had planned but nobody had prevented. The Attorney General's referral regarding the document interference was under active review. This was not resolution. It was the beginning of a longer process that would take months and possibly years and might result in formal charges or might result in something less definitive, because that was how the process worked, and anyone who expected a cleaner outcome than that had not spent much time watching institutions handle their own failures. But there were things that were resolved. The 3 closed adverse event cases were reopened. A clinical review committee, this time with no administrative involvement from anyone in a conflicting position, was appointed to re-examine the findings with the full staffing context that had not been provided the first time. 2 of the 3 cases would receive revised determinations. Families would be notified. That notification would be imperfect and delayed and would not undo what had happened, but it would be honest, which was more than it had been. Vasic's reports, which had been in the system for 18 months, were pulled, properly reviewed, and formally acknowledged. A letter was sent to her from Kraft's office, stating that her concerns had been substantive and that the lack of responsive action to her documentation represented an institutional failure. The letter was careful and precise and did not fully account for what leaving the institution had cost her, but she framed it and put it in the back of a desk drawer because it was something and something was not nothing. The staffing model for the emergency department was referred to a clinical operations review committee with a mandate to produce new guidelines within 90 days. This was the part most likely to produce the paperwork over substance outcome that Dara had anticipated. Whether it would remained to be seen. Louise was appointed interim department coordinator, a designation that came with overdue authority she had been exercising without title for years. She accepted it without ceremony, updated the schedule, and added 2 positions to the open recruitment list that had been sitting unfilled since July. Nolan Vrest did not follow the audit in real time. He had given his statement, answered the follow-up questions from Solano's team, and returned to the business of his own life, which had continued in the way lives do regardless of whether significant things are also happening. His wrist was casted properly now, fiberglass, blue, because the orthopedic technician had given him a choice, and blue seemed fine. Holt had an appointment with the veterinarian who had managed his care since discharge and came back with a clean report and a special chew that he was extremely committed to in the private way of dogs who have found something worth protecting. Nolan thought about the woman in the hospital more than he'd expected to. He thought about her in the way you think about situations that ended well, but only barely, with the residual alertness of someone who knows that a few variables shifted differently and the outcome is not the one that actually happened. He ran the numbers occasionally, in the quiet way of a man with a tactical background. If Holt had given the alert 20 minutes later, if Nolan had let himself be redirected by the staff response and accepted that his concern was misplaced, if the BP cuff reading had been 1 night earlier or 1 night later. He did not send a message. He had no reason to, and she was managing something that required her full attention, and he was not part of it. He worked on his apartment. He unpacked the boxes. Finally, not from any particular motivation, but because one afternoon Holt stood in the middle of the living room looking at the stacked boxes with what appeared to be judgment, and Nolan decided he was done being judged by a dog about his interior design choices. On the 22nd day, he received a voicemail from a number he recognized because he'd put it in his phone after the hospital. The night supervisor, Dolores. She said, "I thought you might want to know. She's doing well. Baby's healthy. She'll be back in the building in about 4 weeks, which is earlier than ideal, but is also extremely her. I'm not giving you her number because it's not my number to give. But I wanted you to know it went the right way." He played the message twice. Then he called Dolores back, got her voicemail, and said, "Thank you. Tell her, if it ever comes up, that Holt says the same." On the 28th day, Dara Weston stood in the doorway of Coastal Ridge Medical Center's emergency department for the first time since she'd left it in a wheelchair. She was not there to work. She was 2 weeks early for that, and Dr. Pell had made her commitment to the 6-week timeline extremely clear. She was there because Quayle had asked her to come in for a meeting, a final follow-up on the formal verification of her service record that would close the documentation process and ensure her file was complete and correctly characterized. She came alone. She had found a parking spot on the second floor of the structure, which was a small practical detail that should not have mattered and somehow did. The normalcy of it, the ordinary logistical act of parking a car and walking into a building she knew well. The ER looked the same. Fluorescent, busy, running at its particular pace. Different faces on the shift. It was mid-morning on a weekday, so the overnight crew was gone. But the machine was the same machine. She stopped at the intake desk for no reason she could entirely explain. The nurse behind it was someone she knew. Petra from the day shift, 26, 2 years in, someone Dara had trained on medication reconciliation protocol 18 months ago. Petra looked up, took a second to process. Weston. Something crossed her face, not quite what Dara expected, not quite pity, something more complicated. "How are you? How's the... Did you... She's great. She's home. She's very opinionated about sleep schedules." Dara paused. "You holding up okay?" Petra gave a short, expressive exhale that communicated about 11 things at once. "It's been a lot, the last few weeks. Everyone's kind of..." She stopped, reorganized. Things are being looked at differently. Like the way we staff, the way we escalate concerns. It's a lot of conversations. Good conversations or bad conversations? Petra thought about it. Mostly honest ones, which is weird, but better than what we had before. She paused. "Louise is different, as coordinator. She came down to the floor yesterday and just talked to people, like asked what was working." A pause. "That hasn't happened in a long time." Dara nodded. She looked at the waiting room. 40-some people. A child asleep across 2 chairs, head in her father's lap. An older man with his arm in a makeshift sling. The specific demography of a community waiting to be helped, which was the same as it always was and the same as it always would be. She was going to come back here. She knew that. Had known it since the day after the delivery, when she was in the hospital bed and had thought about the question clearly for the first time without the distortion of exhaustion. She was going to come back because this was her department, her floor, the machine she understood and had given 6 years to, and the fact that the machine had failed her did not make her belong to it less. It was complicated. Most true things were. She was about to turn toward the administrative corridor when the automatic doors opened and Nolan Vress walked in. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped looking toward the administrative corridor. They were approximately 12 feet apart, in the fluorescent light of a hospital emergency department, and for a moment neither of them said anything because neither of them had planned for this specific moment, and there was no obvious script for it. Holt was not with him. He had, she saw it now, a follow-up appointment card in his hand, the kind you got at discharge for orthopedic consults. "Wrist," she said. "Cast removal. 3 weeks earlier than they said, apparently my bone density is above average." He said it dryly, which the orthopedic tech felt the need to announce loud enough that the whole office heard. Something shifted in her face, closer to a real smile than anything she'd managed in the past 4 weeks. "Where's Holt?" "Downstairs in the car. They don't let dogs into orthopedic clinics, which he finds insulting. He should. Another pause. The department moved around them, indifferent. I got a message, she said, through Dolores about 3 weeks ago. I didn't know if it was appropriate to. It was appropriate. She paused. I wanted to respond. I didn't know how. He nodded once, accepting that without requiring more of it. I'm going back in 4 weeks, she said. To the department. Good. I don't know exactly what I'm going back to. The department is changing, and I don't know how much of it is real change yet. It could be mostly paperwork. Could be, he said. But I'm going back anyway. He looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention she had first noticed across a waiting room and was now closer to, which somehow made it simpler rather than more complicated. Not performed attention, just actual. I know, he said. They stood in the emergency department, in the ordinary noise of a hospital morning, and Dara Weston thought about the night 4 weeks ago when she had stood at this intake desk pressing her palm to her lower back and telling herself she was fine, and about the dog who had moved across a room toward her with more certainty about her condition than she had allowed herself. She thought about what it meant to be seen by something that had no investment in seeing her in a particular way, that simply registered what was true and moved toward it. She thought about what she had spent 5 years building and what the last 4 weeks had cost, and what Marin's hand felt like closing around her finger at 3 in the morning. Coffee, she said. When I'm back on my feet, if you want. Holt can come. She paused. There's a place 2 blocks south that has outdoor seating. Something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was built from the same materials. Yeah, he said. Okay. She nodded once, turned toward the administrative corridor, and walked toward the meeting that would formally close the case of Dara Weston's service record. A record that had never been incomplete, had never been suspicious, had never been anything other than what it was. The documentation of a woman who had done significant things under difficult conditions and had then chosen, quietly, to keep doing them somewhere else. But as she turned, her phone buzzed with a notification she had been waiting for since the previous afternoon. A message from Quayle, sent 4 minutes ago. She stopped walking. Read it. The Attorney General's office had issued a statement. The preliminary review of Price's overnight document modifications had produced enough evidence to proceed. Formal charges were being filed, not misdemeanor record irregularities, which was what his attorney had been managing toward, but 2 counts of falsification of institutional records and 1 count of obstruction of a state regulatory review. She read it twice. She kept walking. But she thought about the morning Price had sent the memo, before her daughter was 4 hours old, while she was still in a hospital bed with her blood pressure at 171/116. And she thought about what that had required of him, the specific kind of person you had to be to make that calculation in that moment. And she felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sorrow, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She pushed through the administrative corridor door. And then her phone buzzed again. A second message. This one from a number she did not recognize, with a Marlow Bay area code. She opened it. It was a photograph. A photograph of 3 people she had not seen together before, in a context that made no sense given what she knew about where each of them was supposed to be right now. A photograph that told her unambiguously that the thing she thought was almost finished had at least one more piece that had not yet landed. She stood in the administrative corridor and looked at the photograph for 11 seconds. 3 people. A coffee shop she recognized, the one on Tanner Street, 2 blocks from the hospital, the same one she had spent many post-shift mornings in when the world felt too close and she needed somewhere ordinary to breathe. A corner table, and at that table, a man she knew as Price's personal attorney, a woman she did not recognize in a business suit, and a third person whose presence in that particular photograph, in that particular location, on the morning of the Attorney General's announcement, was the thing that made her stop walking and stay stopped. The third person was a member of Coastal Ridge's board of directors. His name was Warren Felt. He had been on the board for 9 years. He had chaired the committee that approved Price's last performance review, the one that had praised his management of operational costs and his maintenance of the hospital's financial performance during a difficult period for regional health care. The photograph had no caption, just the image, time-stamped 40 minutes ago. She did not know who had sent it. She saved it, forwarded it to Quayle with 4 words. "Do you know this?" And kept walking. Mom. Quayle was already in the meeting room when she arrived, along with a woman from HR and the hospital's general counsel, a careful man named Adler who had the professional stillness of someone whose job required him to be the least reactive person in any given room. She sat down. She put her phone face up on the table. "Before we start," she said, "I received this 4 minutes ago." She turned the phone so they could see the image. "I don't know who sent it. I don't know if it's relevant, but given the timing, I thought you should see it immediately." Quayle looked at the photograph. His expression did not change, but his eyes moved in a specific pattern, top to bottom, faces, location, timestamp, the way someone reads a document rather than just looks at a picture. He picked up his own phone. "Give me 1 moment," he said. He left the room for 6 minutes. When he came back, the careful, professional stillness he carried had the same surface, but something underneath it was different, slightly more compact, the way a person looks when they have just received information that confirms something they suspected but had not confirmed. "Warren Felt," Dara said. "Yes." "Was he part of it?" Quayle sat down. "That's not a question I can answer for you right now. What I can tell you is that this meeting is going to be postponed and that you're going to be contacted by the AG's office directly, probably by end of day." The HR representative looked between them. "Should I—" "Yes," Quayle said. "Step out and get Kraft on the phone." That the photograph had been taken by Dolores. This emerged later, not dramatically, but in the way that things emerge in a hospital. Someone mentioned it to someone else, and the information traveled. Dolores had been at the coffee shop for her own reasons, post-night shift, ordering the same large black coffee she ordered every Tuesday morning, and she had sat down near the window and recognized Price's attorney at the corner table from the news coverage that had run the previous week. She had taken the photograph not because she was certain of its significance, but because she was a woman with 19 years of institutional memory and a functional understanding of when things that shouldn't be adjacent were being adjacent. She had sent it to the only number she had that she trusted to know what to do with it. She had then gone home and gone to sleep, because she had worked 12 hours, and there was a limit to what any one person could carry. The AG's office contacted Dara at 4:15 p.m., as Quayle had predicted. The call was brief and informational. They were expanding the scope of their inquiry to include board-level governance questions, specifically related to the performance review process, and whether board members had been made aware of the adverse event investigations that Price had managed. She was not a target of any inquiry. They wanted her to know the timeline was extending and that the institution remained under active review. She thanked them, hung up, and sat in her parked car in the hospital structure for a few minutes before driving home. She was not surprised. She was tired. There was a difference. She had understood, from the first day Quayle had explained the scope of the audit to her, that these things did not resolve in a line. They resolved in layers, each one uncovering the surface of the next, and the layers went down further than anyone standing at the top expected. Price had not built his system alone. Systems did not sustain themselves without people at multiple levels choosing, repeatedly, to let them run. The board review would take months. Felt's situation would take whatever it took. She drove home in the early evening, picked up Marin from Tomas's apartment, and sat on the floor of her own living room with the baby doing the specific bicycle leg movements of a 6-week-old discovering that her legs existed, and Dara watched her and felt the day settle into the distance that distance eventually provides. The formal clearing of Dara's service record was completed 10 days later. The document was 3 pages and said, in official language, that her military service record was complete, verified, and contained no discrepancies. The classified operational components were confirmed as legitimate, classified for operational security reasons, unrelated to any conduct by the service member. The memo that Price had sent, a copy of which was now part of the audit record, was characterized in a formal HR addendum as having contained factually inaccurate claims and as having been submitted outside appropriate procedural channels. The HR director sent her a letter. Kraft sent her a separate one, handwritten, which was unusual enough to register. She read them both and filed them and did not spend a great deal of time on the feelings they produced, Because the feelings were real, but they were also beside the main point. The main point was not the vindication of her record. The main point was that the staffing conditions that had produced her crisis had been visible, documented, and managed away for 18 months. And 3 patients had carried the cost of that before she did. And the system that allowed it had been protected by people at multiple levels until it couldn't be protected anymore. Her record being cleared was justice in the small and specific sense. The structural change was the part that mattered past the personal. She held on to that. Yes. Price's charges were formalized on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the night Holt had walked across a waiting room. The press release from the Attorney General's office was 1 page, 2 counts of institutional record falsification, 1 count of obstruction of a state regulatory review, and this was the piece that had taken longest to build, the piece the overnight photograph had opened, 1 count of providing material misrepresentation to a board oversight committee. Specifically, Price had submitted a summary to the board's compliance committee during the period of Vasic's complaints that characterized the department's adverse event investigations as resolved and the underlying concerns as addressed. They had not been resolved, they had not been addressed. The summary he had submitted to the board had said they had. Felt had not known. That was the AG's determination after review. He had relied on the summary. That reliance was, the AG's office noted, its own governance failure, but it was not knowing participation in misrepresentation. Felt would not be charged. He would resign from the board voluntarily, which he did the following Monday, in a brief statement that said nothing and cost him something. Price did not make a statement. His attorney made a statement which said the same nothing as all attorney statements say in that situation. He would enter a plea within the next 60 days. The process would run its course. The Marlow Bay Regional Medical Journal ran a piece on the audit findings. A healthcare regulatory outlet ran a longer one. Neither piece named Dara Weston specifically. She had declined to speak to either journalist, not because she was avoiding the story, but because the story was not actually about her, and she understood that, and she wanted the structural findings to be the part that traveled. The staffing reforms, the reopened patient cases, the governance failures, those were the story. She had just been the moment it became impossible to look away from. She came back to the emergency department on a Tuesday, 7 weeks to the day, not 6 because Dr. Pell had asked for 1 extra week, and Dara had considered arguing and then thought about the look on Pell's face and decided not to. 7 weeks. She had spent them sleeping when Marin slept, eating actual meals, going on increasingly long walks along the waterfront with a stroller that she had initially regarded with suspicion and had come to find useful, and thinking with the specific quality of thought that becomes possible when the acute crisis is over and the real reckoning begins. She thought about what she wanted the next chapter to look like. Not just returning to shifts, not just resuming the department role she had held. She had been good at that role, genuinely good at it, technically precise, reliable under pressure, but she had also been, in a specific and correctable way, invisible in it. Not because she was overlooked, though she had been. Because she had chosen it, had preferred the edges, the quiet, the competent background position that let her do her work without the complications of being fully seen. She understood why she had made that choice. She was not going to keep making it. The department looked the same and was not. Louise was at the coordinator's desk and gave her a nod that carried about 6 months of subtext in it, which Dara returned with equal economy. The new scheduling grid was on the wall, properly staffed, with redundancy built into the coverage model in a way the old grid had not had. The overtime request process had been restructured so that pattern-level overrides required a clinical oversight sign-off, not just administrative approval. It was better paperwork. Whether it was better conditions remained to be proven by time, which was the only thing that ever actually proved it. She clocked in. She pulled her first chart. She worked. 3 hours into the shift, she was at the supply cart near exam room 3. The same cart, the same hallway where she had stood 6 weeks ago and felt the pressure in her skull and told herself it was the lights. When Dr. Renata Forsyth appeared at the end of the corridor, they had not spoken since the night of. Forsyth had sent a text in the first week, 2 sentences, which Dara had responded to briefly. In person now, there was a moment of the specific awkwardness that exists between two people who were professionally proximate to each other during something significant and have not yet found the language for it. "Good to have you back," Forsyth said, meaning it, imperfectly, in the way that people mean things when they are also partly managing their own complicated feelings about a situation. "Good to be back," Dara said, meaning it in the same imperfect way. Forsyth looked like she was going to say something else, and then looked like she had decided not to, which was probably wise. "I have a chest pain in 3 that I'd like a second opinion on," she said instead. "I'll be there in 2 minutes," Dara said. They went to work. Nolan came to the outdoor table at the coffee shop on Tanner Street on a Saturday morning in December, 42 days after Dara had said coffee in the emergency department corridor. Holt walked beside him off-leash, which the coffee shop permitted because it had a sign that said, "Well-behaved dogs welcome," and Holt qualified by any reasonable standard. The morning was cold and gray in the particular way of Pacific Northwest December, which meant the outdoor seating was mostly empty, which suited all 3 of them. Dara was already there. She had Marin in a carrier on her chest, small face visible above the padded edge, eyes open in the wide, unfocused way of an 8-week-old experiencing December morning and apparently finding it acceptable. Dara was wearing a coat she'd had for 4 years and holding a coffee with both hands, and she looked like herself. Not the version that had been running on 17 hours in compression socks and suppressed symptoms, but the version underneath that, the one that had apparently always been there, and that exhaustion and grief and a great deal of deliberate self-effacement had kept fairly well hidden. Holt walked to her immediately, calm and unhurried, and sat beside her chair and looked at the baby with the focused amber attention he directed at things that mattered to him. The baby, in turn, appeared to look at the dog, in the way of infants who may or may not be truly focusing but seem to be. "They like each other," Nolan said. "She likes things that are warm," Dara said. "He's warm." He sat down, got his own coffee from the window, came back. They sat for a moment in the way of 2 people who are not uncomfortable with each other, but are still calibrating the register of the conversation. Not the hospital register, not the professional crisis register, just the ordinary one. "How's the wrist?" she asked. He flexed it once, experimentally. 80%. The PT says 4 more weeks. "You following the PT protocol?" "Mostly." "That means no." He didn't deny it. She looked out at the street, a Saturday morning in Marlow Bay, which meant fishing boats in the channel and people walking dogs and the coffee shop starting to fill with the weekend version of the city that was less harried than the weekday one. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "About what you told me. About Holt's training. The medical alerting piece." "What about it?" "There are 4 hospitals in the Marlow Bay region. 2 of them are running the same staffing model Coastal Ridge was running before the audit. I don't know what their adverse event rates look like. I don't know if their risk management reviews are independent." She looked at her coffee. "I'm not saying I'm the right person to do anything about that. I'm saying I know what a system looks like when it's protecting itself instead of its patients, and I can recognize it now in ways I couldn't before, and I don't think I can unknow that." Nolan was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know yet. Vasic asked me if I wanted to be involved in the ongoing regulatory follow-up. There's a committee forming, clinical oversight of staffing standards, regional scope." She paused. "It would mean less floor time, more meetings. I hate meetings. But I spent 6 years being the person who executed things without being the person who decided them. And decisions got made in my department that I had no part in and that I paid for, and so did my patients." She looked at him. "I think I'm done being quiet about things I know." He looked at her steadily. "You were never quiet about things you knew," he said. "You just said them to the wrong people. Or no people." She considered that. "Accurate," she said. Marin made a small sound, not quite a complaint, more of an editorial. Dara adjusted her in the carrier without looking, the motion so natural it might have always existed. "I'm going to join the committee," she said. "I told Vasic yes last night." "Good. It's going to be slow and bureaucratic and occasionally maddening, and probably the real structural change is 5 years out, not 1. "Most real changes are." She nodded. The coffee was getting cold. She drank it anyway. Holt had not moved from his position beside her chair. He looked from a certain angle like he was on duty. Calm, positioned, present, and from another angle like he was simply somewhere he had decided to be and had no particular plans to leave. Dara looked at him for a moment, then at Nolan. "Can I ask you something that isn't my business?" "You can try." "When you came into the ER that night, the wrist, that wasn't—" She stopped, reconsidered the framing. "That wasn't the only thing going on." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it wasn't." She didn't push. She had asked, he had answered. The edges of the answer were his to manage. "I'm asking because I recognize it," she said. "What you were doing, carrying something privately and leading with the functional problem, the wrist." She paused. "I'm fairly expert at that particular strategy." He looked at her. "I'm also aware," she said, "that it does not actually work." Something shifted in his face. Not discomfort, more like the specific acknowledgement of someone who has been handed an accurate assessment and is deciding what to do with it. "Yeah," he said. "I know. There's a veterans health clinic 2 blocks from the waterfront. The director is someone named Hera. She's good, if that's useful information." He said nothing, but he filed it in the way of a person who actually files things. They sat with the gray December morning, and the dog, and the baby who was somewhere between awake and asleep, and the coffee that was fully cold now, and did not matter. Price entered a guilty plea in February. He pled to 1 count of institutional record falsification and 1 count of obstruction. The other charges were reduced as part of the plea agreement, which was not satisfying in the clean sense and was the ordinary outcome of how plea processes worked, trading the full accounting for the certainty of resolution. His sentence included 2 years of probation, a fine that was substantial in personal terms, and probably not in proportion to the actual cost of what his management had enabled, and a permanent bar from healthcare administrative roles in the state. The bar was the part that mattered most, practically. He would not do this again. In this industry, in this state. That was not nothing. Vasek attended the sentencing in person. She sat in the public gallery and watched the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who is not looking for catharsis but wants to see the record correctly closed. She said nothing publicly afterward. She went to the parking structure, sat in her car for a few minutes, and then drove back to Portland and went to work. She texted Dara that evening. "It's done." Dara was feeding Marin at the time and read the text and thought about everything it took to get to those 2 words. The reports that went unanswered, the resignation that shouldn't have been necessary, the 18 months of nothing, and then the particular chain of events that began with a dog in a waiting room and a man who trusted him. She texted back, "Thank you for not giving up on it." Vasek's response was 3 words, "Neither did you." Dara put the phone down and looked at her daughter, who was looking back at her with the full intensity focus of an infant who has not yet learned to calibrate her attention, who simply looks at the most important thing in her field of vision and looks at it completely. She thought about what it had cost to be quiet for 5 years. Not the grief. The grief had been real and necessary, and she did not regret having protected it. But the other silence, the professional one, the choosing of the background because the foreground felt too exposed. The years of carrying things in the press of palm to lower back way, in the I'm fine way, in the way of a woman who had learned that being needed was safer than being seen. What that silence had cost her, in the end, was almost everything. And what had broken it was not a dramatic choice. It was a dog sitting down at her feet. The specificity of that still moved something in her. The idea that all the while she had been managing her life into invisibility, something had noticed anyway, had walked across a room toward her with a certainty she had not been able to extend to herself, had sat down and refused to be redirected. Marin made a satisfied sound. "Yeah," Dara said softly. "I know." The Clinical Staffing Oversight Committee held its first regional meeting in March. It was a long meeting. There were 12 people at the table, including Vasek, a state regulatory representative, 3 clinical directors from different regional hospitals, and Dara Weston, who sat 3 chairs from the head of the table and asked 4 questions that were more pointed than anyone expected, and that required 3 separate people to go look things up before the next session. She was not the loudest person at the table. She was not trying to be, but she was present in the way she had not allowed herself to be for years, fully, specifically, with her actual knowledge and her actual concerns and the full context of what she knew about what happened when systems stopped seeing the people inside them. The committee would produce recommendations. The recommendations would go through review. Some would be adopted, and some would be watered down, and some would be quietly set aside by people who understood process as a mechanism for delay rather than change. That was the reality of the work, and Dara understood the reality without it diminishing the work. She went to the meetings. She asked the questions. She pushed back when the language softened into something that was technically accurate and practically useless. She was occasionally annoying about it, which she had decided was fine. Vasek told her after the 3rd session, "You're good at this." "I'm good at knowing what the actual problem is," Dara said. "That's a different skill than being good at meetings." In this context, they're the same skill. Dara thought about that. Then I'm getting better at meetings. In April, Marin was 4 months old and had developed opinions about everything. She had opinions about which direction she faced in the stroller. She had opinions about the specific way she was held when she was tired versus when she was not tired, which were different holds, and she was clear about this. She had opinions about Holt, which were uniformly positive. She tracked the dog across any room they shared with the specific intensity of someone who has identified a priority interest and is pursuing it methodically. Nolan brought Holt to the waterfront on a Saturday afternoon in early April, when the light had changed back to something hopeful. Dara walked beside him with the stroller, Marin facing forward, taking in the harbor with her characteristic full attention gaze. They had been doing this, on and off, through the winter. Not with a defined shape, not with the architecture of something formal, just the ordinary accumulation of time spent in the same space, which was its own kind of definition. He had, at some point in February, taken down the number for the Veterans Clinic and made an appointment. He had not told her he'd done this, but she had noticed something change in him, small, incremental, the particular quality of someone who has stopped carrying a weight entirely alone. She had not mentioned noticing. Some things were better acknowledged sideways. They walked the waterfront path, and the water was steel gray, and the fishing boats were going out, and a seal was doing something businesslike near the dock pilings. "She's going to want a dog," Nolan said. "She can't have one." "She's going to want one anyway." "Yes," Dara said. "She's going to want a lot of things she can't have immediately. That's the job." She paused. "The dog thing I'll reconsider when she can pronounce the word responsibility." Holt walked beside the stroller with the serenity of an animal who has done significant things and has arrived at a phase of life that is quieter and finds it genuinely acceptable. His muzzle was grayer than it had been in October. He moved at a pace that had adjusted itself to the pace of the people around him, which was the pace of a Saturday afternoon in April, which was fine. Dara looked at him as they walked. She thought about what one dog's decision, the simple, uncalculated decision to move toward something true, had opened. The audit, the charges, the committee, Vasek's return to the work, Louise with actual authority, 3 families who would receive corrected information about what had happened to their people, a department that was not yet repaired but was being repaired, with more honest hands on it than before. Marin, who was alive, who was here, who was currently attempting to communicate something to a seagull on a piling with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet learned that seagulls do not respond to 4-month-olds. None of it was finished. The committee work would take years. The reform department would have setbacks. Nolan's recovery was not a straight line, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and that was its own complicated, ongoing negotiation. She was still learning how to be seen, still catching herself in the reflex of the background, the shrink, the "I'm fine," and then remembering that she had decided to stop. Remembering was the work. It was ongoing. But she was here, on a harbor path in April, and Marin was pointing at a seagull, and Holt was walking beside the stroller like he'd always been there, and the city was going about its ordinary Saturday business around them, and Dara Weston was not invisible. She had never been invisible. She had just been waiting, for longer than she should have, for someone to confirm what she already knew. She was done waiting for that. The seagull, indifferent to Marin's overtures, indifferent to everything, lifted from the piling and flew out over the water, and Marin watched it go with the expression of someone who has not yet learned to accept that not everything comes when you reach for it, and who will probably learn it, and who for now is simply herself, certain, present, reaching anyway. Dara watched her daughter watch the bird. She thought, this is what it looks like. When you stop disappearing, when you take up the space you were always supposed to occupy. It doesn't look like a ceremony or an award or a vindication speech. It looks like a Saturday in April. It looks like a child pointing at things. It looks like being here, entirely, without apology. She had spent 5 years learning to be small enough that loss could not find her again. What she had not understood then was that smallness does not protect you. It only makes you easier to overlook. And the people who overlook you are not always your enemies. Sometimes they are simply people who needed to be required to see, and who required a dog to walk across a room and sit at your feet before they did. She had been worth seeing the whole time. The harbor stretched out ahead of them, gray and wide and full of its own ongoing life, and Dara pushed the stroller forward into the April morning and did not press her palm to her lower back and did not tell herself she was fine. She was better than fine. She was exactly where she was supposed to be.